Dear students, welcome to E-Patashala. I am Dr. T. Amuda, working as Assistant Professor in Avinashlingam School of Management Technology, Avinashlingam University for Women, Coimbatore. Today I am going to brief you about experimental research and its ethical issue. So under this concept, I would like to explain you what is an experimental research, steps in experimental research, and then the types of experimental research, validity in experimental research, benefits and limitations of experimental research, and about the ethics in experimental research. Now we can see the introduction. What is an experimental research? Experimental research are used to investigate the causal cause and effect relationship between one variable and the other. It is used to study the relationship between one variable and another variable. Experimental research is quantitative in nature. It is the most traditional type of research. Researchers use this experimental research for comparison. They compare two or more groups on one or more measures. In this type of research, one variable is manipulated to see whether it has an effect on the other variable. Experimental research is used in this way to answer the hypothesis. So now let me explain what is hypothesis. Hypothesis is a testable statement or assumptions that are formulated by the researcher to address a specific questions. The researcher design an experiment, study and check whether the hypothesis is supported or disproved in his research. For example, the researcher can set an assumption that there is a significant relationship between rainfall and yield of paddy crops. With this assumption, the researcher can set the hypothesis as if there is increase in rainfall, then there is increase in the yield of paddy crops. In this study, the researcher can check whether the hypothesis is supported or disproved in his research. Here, rainfall is the independent variable which is known as the cause, and yield of paddy is the dependent variable which is known as the effect. Next, we can discuss about the basic terms which is used in the experimental research. It is important to know the basic terms used in experimental research. Now we can discuss with those terminologies. Some of them are independent variables, dependent variables, experimental group and control groups. First, let us see what is an independent variable. Independent variable is the variable that will be manipulated, the cause or treatment variable. Independent variable can be the activity or characteristics that the researcher believes will make a difference. For example, the rainfall is the independent variable. And next comes the dependent variable. So dependent variable is the effect or outcome of manipulating the independent variable. The only constraint is that the outcome must be measurable. For example, yield of paddy of cultivation. Next, experimental group. So it is the group that receives the treatment being investigated. Next comes the control group. It is the group that remains the same in order to have something to compare the experimental group against. Then the next concept is criteria for the experimental research. So here the experimental research must meet these three criteria for the results to be meaningful. So random assignment. Test subjects must be randomly assigned to the treatment groups to control for formation of groups that may systematically differ in another way that impact the results of the treatment. So next comes the experimental control. Here all aspects of the treatment are the same except for the independent variables. If all other factors are controlled and kept constant, then if the quantifiable difference are found in the outcomes, the researcher can be confident that the difference is due to the independent variable, that is the treatment. So next comes the appropriate measures. The measure or outcome must be proper for testing the hypothesis. The outcome measured must correspond to the idea being tested in the hypothesis in order for the results to be valid. Now we can consider the definition and criteria about to explore an example of the experimental research using those concepts. Let's say the researcher wanted to investigate the effect of productivity by changing the intensity of light. For this, we can consider the human relation half-thrown experiment. The initial experiment was known as the illumination study, which aimed at investigating the relationship between workplace lighting and employees' productivity. According to Warren and Bedian, at the beginning, the researcher selected two groups of workers. In the first group, known as the experimental group, the level of lighting was varied. The second one was the control group that had no alterations in light. During the study, the researcher found that the output of workers increased in both the groups. Additionally, the productivity of the experimental group made researchers even more surprised because whether the lighting level was high or low, as ordinary to the moonlight, the output generally increased. One of the employees who were in the experiment was asked to inform about the study. He said that the environment wasn't that bad. It got a little darker, but he couldn't still see what he was doing. The experiment concluded that there is no relationship existing between workers' output and illumination. From the above example, the change in the intensity of light is independent variable. The productivity is the dependent variable. The experimental group is the group where the level of lighting was varied, and the control group is the group that had no alterations in light. This is a classical example of the use of experimental research design. So next comes the steps in experimental research. So researcher should follow the following steps for experimental research. So here it involves 9 steps. Now let us see the first step. The first step is select a topic. So the first and foremost step is to select a topic, which involves simply identifying the area of interest or the general subject. Here the researcher, as the first step, he has to think of 3 important key aspects such as novelty, inventive step and the applications. The second step is to identify the research problem. So after a topic or a subject is selected, the researcher must identify the specific problems or questions related to the subject. Suppose if the researcher is familiar with the subject and may already know the problem they want to search, then the researcher can move to the next step. If the researcher is new to the topic, then the researcher must examine the literature and previous studies related to the subject. Also, the researcher can discuss with the other researchers to get clarity about the subject. The problem selected should be important to the field and be of significance to others in the discipline. Next, the third step is to conduct literature search. So after identifying the research problem, the next step we have to conduct the literature search before proceeding to design the experiment. So literature search helps the researcher to know what studies have been performed, the designs, the instruments used, the procedures and the findings. Next, the fourth step is to construct a hypothesis. So here in this step, the researcher has to formulate the research questions and set the hypothesis. So it is a most critical step. And then the next step is to determine the design of the research. The researcher should review the hypothesis, then the researcher should verify whether experimental design is appropriate research design needed to answer the questions. Next, the sixth step is to determine the research methods. So here in this step, the researcher will identify and plan the details necessary to conduct the research. This includes identifying the test subjects, material data collection, instruments and methods, and the procedures for the conduct of experiment. Then the next step is to conduct the research and test the hypothesis. Here the actual experimental procedures will be carried out in this phase. And the next step is to analyze the data. Here the experimental research data lends itself to variety of potential statistical analysis. The appropriate analysis is determined by the research questions and the type of data. And the last step is to formulate the conclusions. As a final step, the researcher has to review the data and determine if it confirms or disproves the hypothesis. So all these are the basic outline of the steps involved in conducting the experimental research. So now we can move on to the types of experimental research. So here there are three types of experimental research designs. They are the true experimental design, and then the quasi-experimental design, and the pre-experimental designs. Now let us see what is an experimental research design. So here the experimental research design, or most scientifically refined research methods, it is defined as observation under controlled conditions. Experimental research designs are controlled with examinations of the effect of independent variable on the dependent variable is manipulated through treatment or interventions, and the effect of those interventions is observed on the dependent variable. The first type of research is the true experimental design. So now let us see what is a true experimental design. So here the true experimental research design are those where the researcher have complete control over the extraneous variables and can predict confidentially that the observed effect on the manipulation of the independent variable. A true experimental research design must contain the following characteristics. They are the manipulation, and then the control, and randomization. Now let us see what is meant by manipulation. Manipulation refers to conscious control of the independent variable by the researcher through treatment or interventions to observe its effect on the dependent variable. So next comes the control. Here control is another essential element of true experimental design. Control refers to the use of control group and controlling the effect of extraneous variables on the dependent variable in which the researcher is interested. The subject in the control and experimental group are similar in number and characteristics, but the subject in the control group receives no experimental treatment or any interventions at all. The experimental group receives the planned treatment or interventions, and a comparison is made with the control group to observe the effect of this treatment or interventions. So next comes the randomization. So now let us see what is meant by randomization. Randomization means every subject has an equal chance of being assigned to experimental or of study subjects on random basis. With the help of random assignment of subjects under experimental or control group, chances of bias is eliminated. Randomization is used in true experimental research design to minimize the threat of internal validity of the study and to eliminate the effect of extraneous variable on dependent variable. And then now the second type of research. The second type of research is the quasi-experimental research. So here the quasi-experimental research design involves the manipulation of independent variable to observe to effect on the dependent variable, but it lacks at least one of the two characteristics of the true experimental design, randomization or a control group. So here the quasi-experimental designs are generally used to establish the causality, that is the effect of independent variable on the dependent variable in situations where researchers are not able to randomly assign the subjects to groups, or for various reasons no control group is available for an experimental study. Next comes the types of quasi-experimental design. So here there are two types of quasi-experimental design. They are non-randomized control group design and the time series design. Non-randomized control group design. So it is also known as the non-equivalent control group design. This design is identical to the pre-test, post-test control group, except there is no random assignment of subjects in experimental and control groups. In this design, experimental and control groups are selected without randomization and dependent variables are observed in experimental as well as control groups before the interventions. Later, the experimental group receives treatment and after that, post-test observation of the dependent variable is carried out for both the groups to assess the effect of treatment on the experimental group. So next comes the time series design. So now let us see what is a time series design. So here this design is useful when the experimenter wants to measure the effect of a treatment over a long period of time. The experimenter would continue to administer the treatment and measure the effects a number of times during the course of the experiment. Generally, it is a single subject research in which the researcher carries out an experiment on an individual or on a small number of individuals by alternating between administering and then withdrawing the treatment to determine the effectiveness of the interventions. Next, the third type of research is pre-experimental research design. So now let us see what do you mean by pre-experimental research design. Here, this research design is considered very weak because the researcher has very little control over the experiment. So next is the types of pre-experimental research designs. So there are two types of pre-experimental research designs, that is one-shot case design and one group pre-test post-test design. Now let us see what is one-shot case design. In this research design, a single experimental group is exposed to the treatment and observations are made after the implementation of the treatment. There is no random assignment of the subjects to the experimental group and no control at all. So next comes the one group pre-test post-test design. It is the simple type of pre-experimental design where only the experimental group is selected as the study subject. A pre-test observation of the dependent variable is made before implementation of the treatment to the selected groups. The treatment is administered and finally a post-test observation of the dependent variable is carried out to assess the effect of the treatment on the group. Some researcher also argues this design as a subtype of quasi-experimental research design. However, in the absence of both randomization and control group, this design ethically cannot be placed under the classification of quasi-experimental research design. So next concept is validity in experimental research. So here there are two types of validity in the experimental research. So they are the internal validity and the external validity. Now let us see what do you mean by the internal validity. The internal validity refers to the validity of the findings within the research study. It is primarily concerned with controlling the extraneous variables and outside influence that may impact the outcome. So next comes the external validity. So external validity, it refers to the extent to which the result of the study can be generalized or applied to other members of the large population being studied. For this reason, the random selection of participants and random assignment of study participants into groups is critical so that the members of the study are truly representative of the larger population. External validity is concerned with real life applications and have relevance beyond the confines of the experiment. So random selection is really the key ensuring that results are generalizable. So next we can see what are the benefits and limitations of experimental research. So there are many benefits and limitations to experimental research. So now let me explain the benefits and the limitations of the experimental research. First, benefits. So here the experimental research is the most appropriate way for drawing causal conclusions regarding interventions or treatment and establishing whether or not one or more factors causes a change in an outcome. This is largely due to the emphasizing in controlling extraneous variables. if other variables are controlled, the researcher can say with confidence that manipulation independent variable caused a change in the dependent variable. It is a basic, straightforward, efficient type of research that can be applied across a variety of disciplines. Experimental research designs are repeatable and therefore results can be checked and verified. And the other benefits are, due to the controlled environment of experimental research, better results are often achieved. In the case of laboratory research, conditions not found in the natural settings can be created in an experimental settings that allow for greater control and the extraneous variable. Conditions that may take longer to occur in the natural environment may occur more quickly in the experimental settings. There are many variations of experimental research, and the researcher can tailor the experiment while still manipulating the validity of the design. So next comes the limitations or drawbacks. So the limitations. Experimental research can create artificial situations that do not always represent real life situations. This is largely due to fact that other variables are tightly controlled, which may not create a fully realistic situations, because the situations are very controlled and do not often represent the real life. The reaction of the test subjects may not be true indicators of the behaviors in a non-experimental environment. And the other limitations are, here the human error also plays a key role in the validity of the project. It may not be really possible to control all extraneous variables. The researcher must adhere to the ethical standards in order to be valid. Experimental research design helps to ensure internal validity, but sometimes at the expense of external validity. When this happens, the result may not be generalizable to the large population. If an experimental study is conducted in its natural environment, such as hospital or community, it may not be possible to control the extraneous variable. Experimental research is a powerful tool for determining or verifying causation, but it typically cannot specify why the outcome occurred. Next, we can discuss about the ethics in experimental research. So, ethical consideration in research are critical in experimental research. Just as they are in other types of research, ethics are the norms or standards for conduct that distinguish between right and wrong. They help to determine the difference between acceptable and unacceptable behavior on the part of the researcher. Why are ethical considerations so important in research? Because it includes the integrity, reliability, validity of the research findings. It relies heavily on the adherence to the ethical principles. The readers and the public want to be assured that researchers followed the appropriate guidelines for issues such as human rights, animal welfare, compliance with the law, conflict of interest, safety, health standards, and so on. The handling of these ethical issues greatly impact the integrity of the research project and can affect whether or not the project receives funding. Ethical issues are important in all types of research. Regardless of the type of research, the researcher should take into consideration both general research principles and those that are more specific to the types of research. In experimental research, ethical standards prevent against such things as the fabrication or falsifying of data, and therefore promote the pursuit of knowledge and truth, which is the primary goal of research. It is also important to protect research participants and follow the guiding foundations of do not harm if human subjects are utilized in the study. Now we can conclude this session. So here, ethics is a requirement for a human life. It is our means of deciding a course of action. Without it, our actions would be random and aimless. Even with an ethical standard, we may be unable to pursue our research with the possibility of success. To the degree which a rational ethical standard is taken, we are able to correctly organize our research and accomplish the results which may be most useful to the society with most important values. And if any flaws in our ethics will reduce our ability to be successful in our endeavors. Thank you.